Hi, I'm Nick Seiter. I'm a field crop entomologist at the University of Illinois, and in this session I'll be discussing the bean leaf beetle. Now, bean leaf beetle, pretty common pest of soybean. In fact, this is one of those insects that we see in just about every soybean field every year at some level. Now, it's not so common for bean leaf beetle to really do a whole heck of a lot of damage, at least not in Illinois. It's not an insect that we're necessarily used to managing on a year-to-year basis. However, 2020 was that rare year where we did actually have somewhat of an outbreak of this insect and did have to manage it in quite a few fields in Illinois. And in particular, when we look up at the northeastern part of Illinois going on down into central Illinois, we did see some fairly large populations of bean leaf beetle late in the season. And so this would be the second generation of the bean leaf beetle as they were moving into their overwintering sites. Now, when we look at bean leaf beetle, there's actually a little bit of diversity of form with the adults. We have a variety of different color schemes, and in some cases we have this spotted pattern. Excuse me. In other cases we do not. One thing we always see when we're looking at bean leaf beetle adults is this black triangular marking right behind what we call the pronotum here. So no matter what the color scheme of these individuals, no matter whether they have spots or not, they're always going to have this little black triangle just behind the pronotum, this plate that sits just behind the head here. And so that's what you're going to want to key in on to identify this insect. Now, when we look at the life cycle of bean leaf beetle, so they're actually in the same family as both western and northern corn rootworm. And if you look at the adult beetle, of course, just take another quick look at those, looks somewhat similar to a corn rootworm beetle in terms of its overall size and shape and structure, right? And similarly, if you go below ground and look at the larva looks very similar to a corn rootworm larva. And they actually do feed on the roots, or primarily they're going to feed on the nodules on soybean roots. Now, unlike with the corn rootworm, with bean leaf beetle larvae, this feeding does not appear to do any sort of economic damage to the soybean plant. They feed on the nodules, the soybean plant grows more nodules. It's not going to cause lodging, it's not going to cause reduced nutrient uptake the way it does with the corn rootworm. And so actually we don't look at bean leaf beetle larvae all that closely. But these larvae are going to feed and develop on soybean roots and in the roots of various other legumes. So if you go out and dig some of these legumes up during the summer, you may find these larvae, but we don't worry about the larvae so much in terms of management. When we think about management of bean leaf beetle, we're thinking about the beetles, we're thinking about the adults and the sort of feeding that they do. Now in Illinois, bean leaf beetles go through 2 generations per year. And actually it's the overwintering generation that we tend to see most often as a pest, both early in the season when they feed on soybean seedlings right after they've come out of their overwintering sites, and then at the end of the season when they feed on soybean foliage and especially soybean pods just before they overwinter. So we go through 2 generations. You have that overwintering generation, and they're going to spend the winter in woodlots, along fence rows, in leaf residue and soil residue. Occasionally you'll see them actually, I saw a few of these trying to overwinter in my home this last year because I had some bean plants on my back patio. They're one of those insects that overwinters as an adult and seeks leaf litter to overwinter underneath. And actually, they're one of those rare insects where winter temperatures can actually be used to predict survival. Iowa State has a model that looks at cold temperatures during the winter and the effect that that has on adult survival, and especially on the size of that first flush of adults in the spring when they're leaving those overwintering sites. So that's something to keep in mind with beanleaf beetle, is that winter temperatures actually do play a role in survival of that insect. In fact, play a major role in survival of that insect over the winter. But when this insect leaves its overwintering sites in the spring, it will find spring legumes to feed on. This may be alfalfa, this may be clover, this may be a variety of plants. But as soon as soybean plants emerge in the spring, typically beginning anymore in April here in Illinois, April and early May, these beanleaf beetle adults are usually the first insects to find those seedling soybean plants and begin feeding on them. And so they tend to be the first insect pest that we notice every spring. Now, the feeding on those seedlings tends to be pretty inconsequential, at least in terms of defoliation. We don't see a lot of damage from that. In fact, typically it's one of those things where if you wait a couple of weeks, you would never even know it happened. And I've never received a report of beanleaf beetles in the spring actually reducing stand, which is what we would potentially be concerned with from an early season pest in soybean. But they do feed on those seedling plants, and that's when they lay their eggs. Those eggs will relatively quickly hatch, and the larvae will begin feeding again on the nodules of those soybean roots especially, and on the root tissue itself below ground. Now, after a month, 2 months, the adults will emerge. Typically that's in late June on into July that we start seeing those first generation adults. And we really don't see a lot of those first generation adults. One thing you'll find with beanleaf beetle, the periods of time where we see them, notice them the most often, very early in the season and very late in the season. Part of the reason we're noticing that is that they're concentrated on the relatively few fields that are out. So those first few soybean fields emerge, those plants emerge, and it sort of concentrates the beetles in those few fields. And then as more and more fields emerge, the beetles spread themselves out a little bit more, and they sort of fade. We don't notice them as much. Well, this generation that comes out in July, they're able to spread out over the 10 and a half, 11 million acres of soybean that we might see in Illinois in a given year. We don't really tend to see much, if anything, out of that generation right in the middle of the summer. But those adults will, again, lay eggs, and the larvae will go through, or they'll go through a second generation where the larvae will feed again on roots and nodules below the ground. Now that second generation is going to emerge in late August and on into September, mid to late August and on into September. And this again is a generation that we notice quite a bit, and this was the generation last year in Illinois that we saw in some pretty substantial numbers in some cases. And again, it's a situation where as fields mature, as they dry down, those adults start concentrating themselves in the few fields that are still remaining, still green. And so you get this interesting effect with beanleaf beetle, where you see them in the very first fields to be planted early in the season. And then you see them, especially in the very last fields to be planted, the last fields to mature later on in the season. And that's where we really see a lot of them. Now, in terms of damage, it's that defoliation that they do that we really tend to notice. That's what we think of first when we think of beanleaf beetle feeding. That sort of damage is conspicuous. Again, they're one of the most common defoliating insects in Illinois. And because of their life cycle, because they go through 2 generations, you'll see these adults in the field really throughout the entire season. You have a couple of gaps in there, but ultimately you can pick these up in soybeans at just about any time throughout the year. However, in terms of damage, that defoliation is not the most impactful damage that these insects can cause, at least most of the time in Illinois. So one of the first things we need to consider here is the relationship with bean pod mottle virus. This is a viral disease of soybean, relatively common viral disease of soybean in the southern United States in particular. Here in the Midwestern US, we get this a little more sporadically. And this virus can be spread through seed, but it can also be vectored by bean leaf beetles when they feed on infected plant tissue and then feed on a new plant. They can actually transmit this virus. Now you can see here the symptoms on the leaf. You get this sort of crinkling or bumping of the leaves and some of this mottled coloration here. The reason we call it bean pod mottle virus is you actually see discoloration of the seed later on in the season, and if you get enough of this, you can have some impacts on soybean quality. Now again, bean pod mottle virus in Illinois, it's somewhat of a sporadic issue. It's certainly not something that we worry about in every field every year. But where we have problem fields, where we have localized fields where we have a history of bean pod mottle virus problems, then control of bean leaf beetles for that purpose may be justified. You might want to be a little more aggressive in your approach to bean leaf beetle management if you have a field or a series of fields where you have a history of bean pod mottle virus. Throughout most of the state, again, it's somewhat of a sporadic issue. It's not something we worry about all that much, but where you do have a history of bean pod mottle virus problems, you can help to keep that disease under control by controlling bean leaf beetle. Now what we really worry about with bean leaf beetle, and this is an occasional problem in Illinois, again, not something that we deal with every year, but something we dealt with quite a bit in 2020. And that's feeding on the pods themselves and ultimately pod scarring. Now this is somewhat of a unique form of damage to the bean leaf beetle. When you look at these scars on this pod, one thing you'll note here, they're not actually feeding on and targeting the seeds themselves, the way, for instance, a stink bug would, or some other pod feeding insects like corn earworm, for instance, would. They're actually feeding on the skin, the epidermis of the pod itself, a very similar tissue to leaf tissue, right? And they especially begin feeding on this as the leaves begin to mature towards the end of the season. Now when they do this, at this stage, everything's fine. This actually isn't a problem. In fact, if you were to peel that pod apart and look at the seeds, those seeds would be just fine. I know, because on the day I took that picture, I tore those pods apart and looked at those seeds, and they were just fine. What happens here, and you can see it beginning to happen a little bit on this scar here and over here, is that as that pod continues to mature, where this epidermis has been fed away, and especially when it reaches the seams of the pod over here, that pod starts to dry, and that membrane under the epidermis will start to crack and pull away at the margins. And what you get there is an entry point for water, and potentially right along with that, an entry point for molds and pathogens. And so you see a few things when you have a lot of this kind of damage. One, you may see some moldy seeds. You may see some discolored or crinkled seeds, and of course that goes along with, in some cases, the purpling from bean pod mottle virus. Not always, though. Again, we don't always have that virus in our system. You can also see in some cases those seeds will simply rot, and you'll have sort of a black shell or husk left behind where that seed was. And so you can get some reductions, especially in quality, if you have enough of this pod scarring. But in some cases, you can get some reductions in yield in particular. And we did see a fair amount of this last year in Illinois. Certainly, there were a lot of fields sprayed for this. We probably sprayed more fields than we needed to, as we often do. But there were definitely some areas where an insecticide for this sort of damage was justified. And so when we look at bean leaf beetle damage in Illinois, this is probably what concerns us the most. And again, this isn't an issue that we see every year by any stretch of the imagination. But when we do see it, it can be a serious concern. Now, in terms of control, these are just some control data that we collected this last year. And the good news is that in Illinois, we get pretty effective control from a variety of different insecticides. The insecticides that we use most commonly, as you can see, a combination of pyrethroids, of a pyrethroid neonicotinoid combo in there. They all did quite well in terms of bean leaf beetle control, so that's encouraging. None of these materials last terribly long, so that's something you just want to keep in mind in those situations where a control is justified. You can't put this out preventatively. I mean, you can. It's just not going to do you any good. You want to put these out at an economic threshold if you want to get the efficacy out of these materials. And again, and I can't stress this strongly enough, most fields do not need an insecticide for bean leaf beetle. In fact, the vast majority of soybean fields in Illinois in any given year do not need an insecticide for bean leaf beetle. But when we do need to control this insect, it's very doable in Illinois. If you look in some of the literature from the southern United States, Mississippi in particular, but through Arkansas and the Mid-South as well, there are some issues in that part of the country with insecticide resistance in the bean leaf beetle. We haven't observed that in Illinois. Hopefully we continue not to observe that. Another great reason not to put that pyrethroid in the tank if you don't have a compelling reason to do so. When we put out those applications prophylactically, based on a growth stage, based on driving across the field, whatever it might be, all we're doing there is setting us up for a potential resistance problem down the road. So keep that in mind. There is a cost to those applications beyond simply the cost of the material, which admittedly is quite low in most years. We really don't want to be putting those materials out more than we need to, because we don't want to be selecting these populations for resistance. So what are those economic thresholds? When should we think about putting out a control for bean leaf beetle? So again, as I mentioned earlier, the most common damage from bean leaf beetle is defoliation. In fact, we're going to see probably just a little bit of defoliation injury from bean leaf beetle in every field every year, right? If we didn't tolerate any of that, we'd be spraying every field all the time, and we'd be wasting a heck of a lot of money on that. So how much defoliation should we tolerate? Well, before bloom, it's quite a bit. When we look at those seedling infestations that we see so commonly, it's extremely uncommon to see that at any sort of a level in Illinois where that's going to approach yield loss, where that's going to approach any kind of economic damage. Soybeans are extremely tolerant of defoliation before bloom. They have a high ability to overcome that damage, to put on new growth to overcome that damage, and simply it takes a lot of it to stress the plants out to the point where they're actually losing yield. So before bloom, we can tolerate a full 30% of that canopy being removed by bean leaf beetle or whatever else, whatever defoliating insect it happens to be, before we need to even think about putting out any kind of a spray. That's just the reality of the situation. Extremely uncommon to see any sort of a yield limiting infestation of this insect prior to bloom. Again, if you're in a situation where you have a history of bean pod mottle virus, you might want to be a little bit more aggressive than this on those seedling populations, but that's a small minority of the field. That's far from the typical situation in Illinois. After bloom, we get a little more aggressive, although not that much more aggressive. It still takes a heck of a lot of defoliation after bloom before we're seeing any kind of yield loss. After bloom, that economic threshold is 20% defoliation. And just a quick reminder here, when I talk about the economic threshold, okay, that's the level we're recommending you put out a spray to prevent it from reaching the economic injury level. So the actual level where you're losing yield, we're trying to avoid getting to that point with these thresholds. The actual point where you're losing yield is closer to 40% than it is 20%. It's quite a bit higher than that. So just keep that in mind when we talk about these thresholds. The other thing to keep in mind, and I know I've mentioned this in the past in many of my talks, we have a strong tendency to overestimate the actual amount of defoliation that's being done in a field. And so just to give you an idea of what 20% might look like, here's what 16% defoliation looks like. Quite a bit, right? These plants are getting torn up quite a bit before we're measuring that at 16% defoliation. And by the way, when I say measuring, we actually went in and measured this field. That's how we made that determination. We actually went in and measured the percentage of these individual leaflets that have been fed on and removed. So keep that in mind, and if it doesn't look like this, if you haven't reached this point, there's no need to call me, right, about whether or not you need to put out an insecticide and defoliation. When it starts to look like this, like what you see in this picture here, that's when you should start keeping an eye on that field and seeing if it doesn't get any worse. And of course, it should go without saying, but when we have this defoliation, if you're going to put out an insecticide, make sure the insect's still there. Bean leaf beetles in particular do have a reputation for being here today and gone tomorrow. They move from field to field fairly quickly, sometimes without a lot of advance warning, if they have a more appetizing field down the road. So just keep that in mind. We don't want to be putting out revenge sprays for beetle populations or any insect population that's already done its damage and moved on. Now, what about pod feeding? So our threshold for this pod feeding is going to be right around 10% of pods with this scarring, and again, with bean leaf beetles still in the field. Now, one thing to keep in mind, as is usually the case when we look at pod feeding insects, the earlier this damage occurs, the worse it is. And that makes sense when you think about the mechanism of the damage, right? Because we're talking about this hole opening up in the pod, moisture entering that hole, and then the seed slowly decaying after that. So you want to be a little more aggressive on this, drop it to 8% or fewer of those pods scarred if this is occurring while those pods are still green, while they're early on in that kind of R6 stage of development, which is where this sort of damage typically begins. Typically before that, they're content enough to feed on the foliage that's, of course, abundant in those fields. So be a little more aggressive if this damage is occurring while the pods are still green, while they still have a lot of maturing to do, and especially if the beetle numbers are high. And when I talk high, for bean leaf beetle, I'm talking about if you're seeing around 5 per sweep, okay? So we can take a lot of individuals in these fields. And you want to calm that down a little bit. The further and further those pods are allowed to mature. And one thing to keep in mind here, once those pods have dried out, you may still find some bean leaf beetles hanging on, trying to suck whatever moisture and green tissue is left in that plant out of there. But once those pods have dried out, whatever damage they're going to do has already been done. So we're not going to save ourselves any yield if we spray a mature field, as you would expect. going right along with that, keep in mind the pre-harvest intervals of these materials. And I've given you the example of the 4 labeled materials that were in that efficacy trial that I showed you earlier. This range 18 to 30, some are as high as 45 days. That's fairly typical. None of these are materials that you can spray right before harvest anyway, but just keep in mind, if you need to put one of these insecticides out for control of these beetles around that pod feeding window, by doing that, you've committed to waiting this long before you harvest that field. So just keep that in mind. And again, that kind of goes right along with the fact that the earlier this feeding occurs, the more serious it's going to be and the more aggressive you should be with your management approach. But do want to emphasize and remind you, they're feeding on the pod. The mechanism of that damage is moisture getting into that pod and reducing the quality of the seed. They're not feeding directly on the seed. So just keep that in mind as you develop your management approach to this insect. If we see it again, which hopefully we don't see it again for several years since we had such a bad year with it this last season. With that, I do want to point out a couple of links to resources with our management information. So this link to the 2019 applied research results, we'll have 2020 results out hopefully by the time this recording is released. If they're not out by the time this recording is released, those results will be posted to the second link I'm showing you, which is Crop Central. That's going to be our source for management information, production management information on a variety of topics going forward. With that, thank you for your time. Thank you for viewing this session. And you're always more than welcome to give me a call, shoot me an email, shoot me a text, or get a hold of me on Twitter if you're into that sort of thing. If you have any questions about this topic, really about any topic on insect management in Illinois. Thank you.